In the summer of 1968, a 16-year-old boy from Ontario stood at the Canadian-American border with forged documents in his pocket and a lie on his lips. His real name doesn't matter anymore. To the United States Marine Corps, to his fellow Marines, and to history, he became John Lee. This is the story of how a Canadian teenager deceived the American military system, survived some of the most intense combat of the Vietnam War as a helicopter door gunner, and was only discovered after shrapnel from a machine gun nearly destroyed his hand. It's a story about idealism twisted into tragedy, about a boy who believed so deeply in fighting communism that he was willing to risk everything: his identity, his future, and ultimately, his life. The year 1968 was a turning point in the Vietnam War. The Tet Offensive had shocked America, protests were erupting across college campuses, and the anti-war movement was gaining momentum. But in certain corners of Canada, a different sentiment prevailed. While thousands of young Americans were fleeing north to avoid the draft, a smaller but significant number of Canadians were heading south to volunteer. What many people don't realize is that anti-communist sentiment in Canada during the Cold War was enormous. The fear of Soviet expansion, the domino theory, the belief that communism had to be stopped, these ideas weren't uniquely American. Many Canadians, particularly those with military backgrounds, supported the war in Vietnam wholeheartedly. They saw it as a necessary fight, a moral imperative, the front line of freedom versus tyranny. The boy who would become John Lee came from a military family. Of the 7 men in his extended family who were of military age during the Vietnam era, 5 went to war. His uncles had served in World War II. They had fought against fascism, had seen real evil, and had come home as heroes. They talked about duty, honor, and the responsibility to stand against totalitarianism wherever it emerged. The boy listened to these stories growing up, absorbing the lessons, building a worldview where military service wasn't just honorable, it was essential. But there was a problem. He was only 16 years old, too young to enlist in the Canadian military, too young to legally enlist in the American military, and yet the war was happening now. Young men were fighting and dying now. Communism was spreading now. Waiting 2 more years felt like cowardice, like standing on the sidelines while others did the hard work. So he made a decision that would change his life forever. He would cross the border, assume a false identity, and enlist in the United States Marine Corps. Getting across the border was the easy part. In 1968, the Canadian-American border was far less militarized than it would become in later decades. A confident teenager with a plausible story could make the crossing without raising too many questions. The harder part was what came next, convincing the Marine Corps to accept him without proper documentation. Research suggests that for every American who went to Vietnam, approximately 1 Canadian made the journey south to fight. That's a staggering ratio. Tens of thousands of Canadian volunteers. How is this possible? How did so many young men, many of them underage, manage to slip through the system? The answer lies in a combination of factors: desperate recruitment quotas, overwhelmed administrative systems, and a network of people who facilitated these illegal enlistments, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not. When the boy arrived at the Marine Corps recruiting office in an American border town, he was nervous but determined. He had prepared his story carefully. He would be John Lee, an American citizen whose documentation had been lost in a house fire. It was a common enough lie that recruiters had heard it before, and in the chaos of 1968, with the military desperate for bodies, they often didn't look too closely. The recruiting office was a small utilitarian space: metal desks, recruitment posters on the walls showing square-jawed Marines in dress blues, filing cabinets stuffed with paperwork. The recruiter was a staff sergeant, probably in his early 30s, with the weathered look of someone who had already done his time in the jungle and was now working the easier job of finding replacements. The boy walked in, trying to project more confidence than he felt. He was tall for his age, which helped, but his face still carried the softness of adolescence. The recruiter looked him up and down with an expression that was hard to read. "I want to volunteer for the Marine Corps," the boy said, his voice steadier than his hands. The recruiter studied him for a long moment. Then he said something the boy would never forget. "You're an idiot." Not, "Thank you for your service." Not, "We need men like you." Just flat, unvarnished honesty. "You're an idiot." The recruiter wasn't wrong. Volunteering for the Marines in 1968 was volunteering for almost certain deployment to Vietnam. The Marine Corps was bearing some of the heaviest combat of the war, operations like Khe Sanh, Hue City, the Ashau Valley. The casualty rates were brutal, and this kid was walking in off the street, eager to sign up. But the recruiter also had a job to do. He had quotas to meet. The war machine needed constant feeding, and every body that walked through that door was one less recruitment goal he had to worry about. So, despite calling the boy an idiot, he pulled out the necessary paperwork. "You got documentation?" the recruiter asked. This was the critical moment. The boy launched into his prepared story about the house fire, the lost papers, the urgency of wanting to serve his country. The recruiter listened with the expression of someone who had heard every variation of this story 100 times before. He didn't believe it, but he also didn't care enough to dig deeper. "So we'll need a parent or guardian signature since you look young," the recruiter said. The boy had anticipated this. "I can get that," he said. What happened next reveals just how systematic this illegal recruitment pipeline had become. Outside the recruitment office, literally standing on the street nearby, there was a woman. She was middle-aged, unremarkable in appearance, the kind of person you wouldn't look at twice. But she had a very specific purpose. She forged parental consent documents for underage boys trying to enlist. She wasn't doing this for money, or if she was, it wasn't much. She was doing it because she believed she was performing a patriotic service. In her mind, these boys were heroes, answering their nation's call, and the bureaucratic requirement for parental consent was an unnecessary obstacle to their righteous mission. She was helping them fight communism. She was supporting the troops. She probably slept soundly at night, convinced she was doing the right thing. The boy approached her, and within minutes, he had a forged document claiming that his legal guardian consented to his enlistment. The signature was practiced, professional, utterly fake. He walked back into the recruitment office and handed it to the staff sergeant. The recruiter glanced at it, filed it with the rest of the paperwork, and that was it. No verification, no phone calls, no background check. The system was designed to move people through as quickly as possible, and that's exactly what it did. "Emma, congratulations," the recruiter said without enthusiasm. "You're now the property of the United States Marine Corps. Report to Parris Island for basic training in 3 days." The boy, now officially John Lee, according to his enlistment papers, walked out of that office with a mixture of emotions: pride, certainly, fear, definitely, but also a creeping sense that he had just made a decision he couldn't unmake. He had signed his life away to an organization that didn't know his real name, didn't know his real age, and didn't know he was a foreign national illegally enlisting in their military. There was no going back now. Over the next 3 days, John Lee said goodbye to his old life. He couldn't tell his parents what he had done. They would have stopped him, dragged him back across the border, made sure this insane plan never came to fruition. He told himself he would write to them once he was safely through basic training, once it was too late for them to intervene. He told himself they would understand eventually. He told himself a lot of things that probably weren't true. What he didn't tell himself, what he couldn't have known, was how the next 9 months would unfold. He didn't know about the helicopter, the machine gun, the mission that would go horribly wrong. He didn't know about the shrapnel that would tear through his hand, the pain that would become a permanent companion, the pieces of metal that would still be working their way out of his flesh more than 50 years later. He didn't know that his false identity would be discovered, that he would be sent home in disgrace, that his parents would be not particularly pleased, or that his uncles, those World War II veterans he had idolized, would be the only ones to tell him they were proud. He didn't know he would sell his Purple Heart and his dress blues during hard times, erasing the physical evidence of his service. He didn't know that decades later, he would say that if he could go back in time, he would convince himself not to go. All he knew in that moment was that he had made his choice. He was going to war. John Lee boarded a bus heading south, carrying nothing but a small bag and a heart full of conviction. 3 days later, he arrived at Parris Island, South Carolina, where the United States Marine Corps would attempt to transform a 16-year-old Canadian boy into a warrior. They had no idea what they were getting, and neither did he. The transformation from civilian teenager to United States Marine is designed to be brutal, efficient, and absolute. For 13 weeks at Parris Island, drill instructors break down everything a recruit thinks he knows about himself and rebuild him according to Marine Corps specifications. It's a process that has turned millions of young men into warriors, But it's also a process that was never designed to handle a 16-year-old Canadian boy operating under a false identity. John Lee never spoke much about his time in basic training. Even decades later, when he would occasionally share stories about Vietnam, the weeks at Paris Island remained a closed chapter. Perhaps the experience was too raw, too personal, too tied to the lie he was living every single day. Or perhaps it was simply that basic training, for all its legendary difficulty, pales in comparison to what came after. What we do know is that he survived it. He completed the rifle range qualifications, the obstacle courses, the forced marches, the endless physical conditioning. He learned to field strip an M16 blindfolded, to respond instantly to commands, to think of himself not as an individual but as part of a unit. The drill instructors screamed at him, insulted him, pushed him to what felt like his breaking point and then pushed harder, and through it all, he kept his secret. Nobody discovered that John Lee was really a Canadian teenager with forged documents. In early 1969, newly minted Marine John Lee received his orders, Vietnam, 1st Infantry Division, assignment to follow upon arrival in country. For many Marines, this moment, receiving orders to a combat zone, brought a complex mixture of fear and eagerness. They had been trained for this. They wanted to prove themselves. They also desperately didn't want to die. For John Lee, there may have been an additional layer of emotion. He had lied his way into this war. He had crossed an international border, assumed a false identity, and deceived the most powerful military in the world. And now he was actually going. The abstract concept of fighting communism was about to become terrifyingly concrete. The flight to Vietnam was long, uncomfortable, and filled with men trying to hide their fear behind bravado. Some told jokes, some slept, some stared out the windows in silence. When the plane descended toward Da Nang Air Base, the reality of their situation became impossible to ignore. This wasn't training anymore. This was real. The heat hit like a physical force when the aircraft door opened. Vietnam in 1969 was a blast furnace. Humid, oppressive, the kind of heat that soaked through your uniform within minutes and never left. The smell was equally overwhelming. Jet fuel, human sweat, burning trash, and underneath it all, something organic and ancient that spoke of jungle and danger. John Lee was processed through the arrival system with hundreds of other new Marines, assigned to his unit, and given his initial orientation. The veterans, the ones who had been in country for months and wore their experience in their tired eyes, looked at the new arrivals with a mixture of pity and irritation. Fresh meat, FNGs, fucking new guys who didn't know anything yet and would probably get someone killed with their inexperience. But before John Lee could fully settle into his role as a basic infantryman, an opportunity presented itself. An officer was looking for volunteers for a specific job, helicopter door gunner. In the Vietnam War, helicopters were everything. They were supply lines, medical evacuation, troop transport, and close air support all rolled into one. The iconic image of the Vietnam War, a Huey helicopter with its distinctive whop-whop-whop sound, door gunners manning M60 machine guns on either side, was iconic for a reason. Helicopters defined the war's mobility and tactics. Door gunners were critical to helicopter operations. Their job was to provide suppressing fire during insertions and extractions, to watch for threats from the ground, to protect the aircraft and its passengers. They sat in the open doorways of the helicopter, strapped in but completely exposed, manning weapons that could deliver devastating firepower, but also made them highly visible targets. When the officer asked for volunteers, John Lee raised his hand. His reasoning seemed logical at the time. Being in a helicopter had to be safer than being on the ground, right? Ground infantry walked through jungles filled with booby traps, conducted patrols where ambushes could come from anywhere, and spent nights in the bush where the Viet Cong owned the darkness. A helicopter could fly above all that. You'd be up in the air, away from the mud and the mines and the close-quarters terror of jungle combat. It made perfect sense. It was also completely, catastrophically wrong. What John Lee didn't know, what they didn't tell him until after he had already volunteered, was that helicopter door gunners had one of the shortest life expectancies of any job in Vietnam. The statistics were grim. Door gunners were exposed, visible, and priority targets. Enemy fighters knew that taking out a door gunner made the helicopter vulnerable. They aimed for the doors. They aimed for the men manning the guns. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army soldiers weren't stupid. They understood helicopter tactics. They knew the patterns, The approach vectors, the vulnerable moments during landing and takeoff. They prepared ambushes specifically designed to bring helicopters down, and door gunners, sitting in open doorways, were the easiest targets on the aircraft. But by the time John Lee learned this information, it was too late. He had volunteered. The Marine Corps doesn't let you unvolunteer once you've raised your hand. He was a door gunner now, whether he liked it or not. There was one small compensation, a promotion to corporal. The Marine Corps needed door gunners badly enough that they were willing to promote young Marines who took the job. It was a practical decision. Door gunners needed to have enough rank to command respect and make quick decisions, but it was also a tacit acknowledgement of the job's danger. They promoted you because you probably wouldn't live long enough for a normal promotion cycle. So John Lee, still just 16 years old, became Corporal John Lee, door gunner. The training for door gunners was intense but relatively brief. He learned the M60 machine gun intimately, how to clear jams mid-flight, how to change barrels when they overheated, how to estimate lead and distance while the helicopter banked and turned. He learned hand signals for communicating with the pilots over the roar of the rotors. He learned how to strap in securely while still maintaining freedom of movement. He learned what different types of ground fire looked like and sounded like. Most importantly, he learned to watch. A door gunner's eyes were constantly scanning. Tree lines, rice paddies, villages, anywhere an enemy fighter might be hiding. You looked for muzzle flashes, Martin, for movement, for anything out of place. Your life and the lives of everyone on that helicopter depended on seeing the threat before it could shoot you down. His first combat mission was a troop insertion into a hot LZ, a landing zone where contact with the enemy was expected. The helicopter came in fast and low, the door gunners on both sides opening fire into the tree line to suppress any enemy fighters. The noise was deafening. The rotor blades, the machine guns, the yelling, the radios crackling with urgent communications. Marines jumped from the helicopter, while it hovered a few feet above the ground, hitting the dirt and immediately running for cover. The whole insertion took maybe 30 seconds, and then the helicopter was climbing away, banking hard, the door gunners still firing to cover the withdrawal. John Lee had just experienced his first taste of real combat. His hands were shaking from adrenaline, his ears were ringing. He was simultaneously terrified and exhilarated. He was alive. And so began the strangest period of his short military career. For months, Corporal John Lee flew combat missions across South Vietnam. He participated in insertions and extractions, medical evacuations under fire, supply runs to remote fire bases, reconnaissance missions deep into enemy territory. He learned the rhythms of helicopter combat, the tension during approach, the chaos of landing, the relief of getting back in the air. He learned to read the landscape below, to distinguish between a peaceful farming village and a potential ambush site. He learned what tracer fire looked like arcing up toward his helicopter, and he learned the sick feeling in his stomach when those tracers got too close. He also learned about his fellow door gunners. Many of them were young, barely older than he was, though none of them knew he was actually younger. They formed the dark humor camaraderie that combat soldiers develop, joking about death, because the alternative was dwelling on the very real possibility that any mission could be their last. The other gunners talked about odds and luck and fate. They had superstitions, certain pairs of socks they always wore, specific ways they loaded their ammunition, rituals performed before every flight. They talked about door gunners who had been killed, about helicopters that had been shot down, about the randomness of who lived and who died. John Lee listened and learned, and kept flying. Here's the strange irony that would only become clear in retrospect. John Lee had two uncles who served full tours in Vietnam, 2 to 3 years each. Both of them came home without a single Purple Heart, meaning they completed their entire service without being wounded seriously enough to warrant the medal. They were infantry. They walked through the jungle, conducted patrols, participated in operations, and they came home physically intact. Meanwhile, John Lee chose what he thought was the safer option. He volunteered for a job that would keep him above the danger, away from the ground combat, protected by altitude and speed, and that decision would lead directly to the injury that would define the rest of his life. For months, though, he was lucky. Mission after mission, insertion after insertion, he came back unharmed. He saw helicopters take fire. He saw other aircraft hit, smoking, making emergency landings. He heard about door gunners being killed or wounded, but somehow he remained untouched. He started to believe in his own luck. Maybe he was one of the ones who would beat the odds. Maybe his volunteer decision, despite the statistics, would actually work out. Maybe. And then came the mission that changed everything. Decades later, when asked about his time in Vietnam, the man who had been John Lee would remain mostly silent. He didn't talk about the heat, the fear, the endless missions, or the friends he made and lost. But there was one story, one single combat experience that he would share. It was the only story he ever told about what actually happened in the jungle, and it was the story of the day that ended his war. The mission started like dozens of others he had flown. A Marine unit on the ground was in trouble and needed immediate extraction. They were pulling back from an area where they had made contact with the enemy, and they needed helicopters to get them out before the situation deteriorated further. This was routine for helicopter crews in Vietnam. Combat extractions happened constantly, and while they were always dangerous, they were also just part of the job. The flight out to the extraction point was tense but uneventful. The crew chief ran through the usual checks. The pilots confirmed coordinates with ground forces, and John Lee and the other door gunner made sure their M60 machine guns were loaded and ready. The landscape below them was the familiar patchwork of rice paddies, villages, and thick jungle that characterized this part of Vietnam. As they approached the landing zone, the radio chatter became more urgent. The Marines on the ground were in contact with the enemy. They needed extraction now. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. The helicopter descended toward the LZ, and that's when John Lee saw them, the Marines on the ground pulling back toward the landing zone in a fighting retreat. They were moving fast, firing behind them as they ran, and behind them, pursuing aggressively, were North Vietnamese soldiers. What John Lee saw next would stay with him for the rest of his life. The enemy soldiers weren't conducting a typical pursuit. They were charging forward in a mass assault, closing the distance with terrifying speed. He would later describe it as almost like a banzai charge, the kind of desperate, all-out attack that sacrifices tactical caution for raw momentum and aggression. The helicopter touched down, rotors still spinning, and the retreating Marines began running toward it. They were exhausted. Some were wounded. All of them were firing backward at the pursuing enemy forces. The situation was exactly what every helicopter crew feared: a hot extraction with enemy forces, danger close to friendly troops. And this created an impossible problem for the door gunners. Normally, during an extraction under fire, the door gunners would open up with their M60s, laying down suppressing fire to keep enemy heads down and protect both the landing zone and the Marines being extracted. But in this situation, the enemy was so close to the retreating Marines that firing the machine guns would risk hitting friendly forces. The fields of fire overlapped. The distances were too short. The chaos was too intense. John Lee sat behind his M60, finger near the trigger, watching the scene unfold with growing horror. The North Vietnamese soldiers were getting closer. The Marines were running as fast as they could, but some were carrying wounded comrades, slowing them down. The enemy was closing the gap, and the door gunners couldn't shoot. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. Here was John Lee, strapped into a helicopter with one of the most powerful weapons in the American arsenal, watching his fellow Marines in mortal danger, and he couldn't do anything to help them. Firing would kill the very men he was supposed to protect. Not firing meant watching the enemy get closer and closer. He would later describe the experience as terrifying. And that single word doesn't capture the complexity of emotions, the fear, the frustration, the desperate desire to do something, anything, combined with the paralyzing awareness that any action might make things worse. Combat often involves fear, but this was a specific kind of terror, the helplessness of having power but being unable to use it. The Marines reached the helicopter and began piling in, some of them literally throwing wounded comrades through the doors. The crew chief was screaming for the pilots to take off the moment the last man was aboard. The helicopter was heavy with extra weight, the rotors straining, the whole aircraft vulnerable while sitting on the ground, and the North Vietnamese soldiers were still coming. At some point during this chaos, and John Lee was never entirely clear on the exact sequence of events because everything happened so fast, the enemy got close enough to open fire on the helicopter itself. Rounds started hitting the aircraft, the distinctive sound of bullets striking metal, that sharp ping-ping-ping mixed with the roar of the rotors and the yelling and the general chaos of the extraction. One of those rounds hit John Lee's M60 machine gun. The bullet struck the gun mechanism with tremendous force, and the weapon essentially exploded. Metal fragments, Shrapnel from the damaged gun mixed with pieces of the bullet itself sprayed in all directions, and John Lee's hand and wrist, which had been gripping the weapon, absorbed the full impact. The pain was instant and overwhelming. It was the kind of pain that short-circuits rational thought, that reduces the entire world to a single point of white-hot agony. He looked down at his hand and saw blood, torn flesh and metal fragments embedded in his skin. His hand didn't look like a hand anymore. It looked like meat. He tried to scream, but the noise was lost in the general chaos. The helicopter was already lifting off, the pilots not aware that one of their door gunners had just been seriously wounded. The Marines who had just been extracted were focused on their own wounded, on getting accountability of their unit, on dealing with their own trauma. For a moment, John Lee was alone with his pain, alone with the realization that something terrible had just happened to him, alone with the sight of his destroyed hand. Then the crew chief noticed, saw the blood, saw John Lee doubled over, saw the damaged machine gun. The crew chief immediately moved to help, pulling a first aid kit, trying to stop the bleeding, yelling into the intercom to alert the pilots that they had a wounded door gunner. The helicopter banked hard, changing course for the nearest medical facility. The other door gunner took over, watching both sides of the aircraft, and John Lee sat there, hand wrapped in increasingly blood-soaked bandages, going into shock, barely aware of what was happening around him. The pain was one thing, intense, constant, all-consuming, but there was also something else starting to creep into his consciousness, something almost worse than the physical agony. The realization that his injury meant medical treatment, and medical treatment meant paperwork, and paperwork meant records, and records might reveal that Corporal John Lee wasn't who he claimed to be. The helicopter landed at a field hospital, and John Lee was rushed into emergency treatment. Doctors and nurses swarmed around him, cutting away his blood-soaked uniform, examining the damage, prepping him for surgery. The shrapnel had done tremendous damage, crushing bones, shredding muscle, embedding dozens of metal fragments deep into the tissue of his hand and wrist. The surgery took hours. Doctors removed as many pieces of shrapnel as they could locate and extract, but the damage was so extensive that they couldn't get everything. Some fragments were too deep, too close to nerves or blood vessels, too risky to remove without causing even more damage. Those pieces would have to stay, becoming permanent residents in his flesh. When John Lee woke up from surgery, his hand was heavily bandaged, immobilized, throbbing with a deep ache that the pain medication could only partially suppress. He was alive. He would keep his hand, though it would never function properly again, and he had earned himself a Purple Heart, the medal given to service members wounded in combat. But he had also triggered something else, an official investigation into his identity. The military medical system is thorough and bureaucratic. Every wounded service member generates extensive paperwork, medical records, injury reports, documentation for medals and benefits. And somewhere in that process, someone noticed discrepancies in John Lee's file. The documentation didn't quite add up. Details didn't match. Questions were raised. And when those questions were investigated seriously, the entire false identity collapsed. The Marine Corps discovered that Corporal John Lee was actually a 16-year-old Canadian citizen who had enlisted illegally using forged documents. He wasn't an American. He wasn't even old enough to be in the military. His entire service record was built on a lie. The interview when they confronted him about this was probably one of the most surreal moments of his life. Here he was, lying in a hospital bed, his hand destroyed, having just survived intense combat, having earned a Purple Heart. And military officials were telling him that none of it was legitimate. He had served honorably, fought bravely, been wounded in action, but he had also committed fraud, lied to the government, and violated multiple laws. What do you do with a case like this? He was too young to prosecute as an adult. He was a foreign national, so regular military justice procedures didn't fully apply. He had been wounded in combat, which created its own complications, and prosecuting him would potentially expose the systemic failures that had allowed him to enlist in the first place: the overwhelmed recruitment system, the forged documents, the woman on the street who had helped dozens or hundreds of underage boys lie their way into the military. The Marine Corps made a decision. They would send him home, quietly. No court-martial, no public scandal, no official investigation that might embarrass the recruitment system. Just put him on a plane back to Ontario and pretend the whole thing never happened. But first, they would give him his Purple Heart, because regardless of how he got there, Regardless of the lies he told, he had been wounded in combat serving with the United States Marine Corps. That was real. That mattered. The blood was real. The shrapnel was real. The sacrifice was real. So in a small, quiet ceremony, nothing like the formal medal presentations you see in movies, someone pinned a Purple Heart to John Lee's hospital gown. It was awarded to a name that wasn't his, for service under a false identity in a war he had entered illegally. But it was also awarded for genuine courage, real sacrifice and blood that had been shed in combat. 9 months. That's how long John Lee's war lasted. 9 months from enlisting under a false name to being medically evacuated with a destroyed hand. 9 months from crossing the border as a 16-year-old boy to lying in a hospital bed as a wounded veteran. 9 months that would define the rest of his life. As the plane carried him back to Canada, back to Ontario, back to the life he had tried to leave behind, the former John Lee had plenty of time to think about the decisions that had led him here, about the idealism that now seemed naive, about the hand that throbbed with constant pain, about the metal fragments still embedded in his flesh that doctors said might work their way out over the years. He was going home, but he was bringing the war with him. The plane descended toward Ontario, and with every mile closer to home, the former John Lee felt the weight of what he had done settling more heavily on his shoulders. He was no longer a Marine. He was no longer John Lee. Thus, he was just a 17-year-old boy with a shattered hand, a Purple Heart earned under a false name, and a story that seemed increasingly unreal even to himself. How do you explain to your parents that you lied to them, crossed an international border, assumed a fake identity, joined a foreign military, fought in a war, and came home wounded, all before you were old enough to vote? How do you put that conversation into words? The answer, it turned out, was that you couldn't, not really. When he arrived home, his parents were waiting. They had been notified by military officials that their son was being returned to Canada after serving illegally in the United States Marine Corps. The notification had been formal, bureaucratic, stripped of emotion. It had not prepared them for seeing their teenage son step off a transport with his hand bandaged, his eyes different, his whole bearing changed. The reunion was not what returning soldiers dream about. There were no tears of joy, no proud embraces, no celebration of homecoming. His parents were, in his own words from years later, not particularly pleased. Not particularly pleased. The understatement carries its own weight. His parents had spent months not knowing where their son was, fearing the worst, and then discovering he had deliberately deceived them to go fight in one of the most controversial wars in modern history. They had lived with the terror of not knowing if he was alive or dead. They had been lied to, and now here he was, wounded, different, carrying the physical and psychological scars of combat. The anger was understandable. So was the disappointment. So was the complicated mixture of relief that he was alive and fury that he had put them through this ordeal. They had raised him, loved him, tried to keep him safe, and he had thrown all of that away to chase some romantic notion of heroism that had nearly gotten him killed. The house felt both familiar and alien. His old room was exactly as he had left it, but he was no longer the person who had lived there. The routines of civilian life, family dinners, household chores, the rhythms of normal suburban existence felt strange and disconnected from the reality he had just experienced. How do you sit at a dinner table making small talk when you've been in a helicopter under fire? How do you care about homework or weekend plans when you've seen men die? But if his parents struggled to understand what he had done, his uncles, the World War II veterans who had fought against fascism, had a completely different reaction. They were proud of him. These men had served in their own war, had faced their own horrors, had made their own sacrifices. They understood something that his parents couldn't, that sometimes young men make decisions based on ideals that seem foolish to everyone else but make perfect sense to the person making them. They understood the pull of duty, the desire to be part of something larger than yourself, the belief that some causes are worth fighting for. His uncles didn't focus on the lie he had told or the laws he had broken. They focused on the fact that he had served, that he had fought, that he had been wounded in combat. In their eyes, he was a veteran. He had done his duty. The circumstances of how he got there were less important than the fact that when it mattered, he had stood up and fought. Their support meant everything to him during those difficult early months back home. When his parents were cold and distant, his uncles would invite him over, would let him talk or not talk as he preferred, would treat him with the respect due to a fellow veteran. They understood the difficulty of transitioning from combat to civilian life. They understood the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the way certain sounds or smells could trigger intense memories. They also understood something else, that he had earned the right to wear his uniform and display his Purple Heart, regardless of the complicated circumstances of his service. And for a while, he did exactly that. There exist photographs, though they are now lost or in private collections, of the young veteran wearing his Marine Corps dress blues, the Purple Heart ribbon visible on his chest, looking simultaneously proud and haunted. These photos captured a moment in time, a young man trying to hold on to his identity as a Marine, trying to make sense of what he had experienced, trying to believe that it had all meant something. The dress blues uniform is iconic. Dark blue coat with red trim, high collar, brass buttons gleaming. It's the uniform that appears on recruiting posters, the uniform worn at formal ceremonies and military balls. It represents the best of what the Marine Corps wants to project. Discipline, honor, tradition, excellence. For the former John Lee, wearing that uniform was a way of holding on to something important. It was proof that he had served. It was visible evidence that his experience had been real, that he hadn't imagined the whole thing, that for 9 months he had been a United States Marine. But uniforms and medals don't pay bills. Pride doesn't put food on the table. And as the years passed and life became more complicated, the former Marine faced financial hardships that many veterans experience. The transition to civilian life is difficult for any veteran, but it's especially challenging for someone who served under a false identity and was quietly sent home without official recognition. He couldn't access veterans' benefits because officially he had never served. He couldn't use his military experience on job applications because explaining it would mean explaining the fraud. He was a veteran without status, a combat-wounded Marine without documentation. During particularly difficult financial times, times when he needed money for rent, for food, for basic survival, he made the painful decision to sell his dress blues uniform and his Purple Heart. Imagine that moment. Imagine holding that medal, the Purple Heart with its purple ribbon and gold border, knowing it represents blood you shed and pain you endured. Knowing it's one of the few physical proofs that your service was real, and then handing it to a buyer, taking the money, watching it disappear into someone else's collection. He sold it all. The uniform, the medal, everything from his time in the Marine Corps. He erased the physical evidence of his service because he needed to survive in the present more than he needed to remember the past. Years passed. Decades passed. The Vietnam War ended, became history, became the subject of movies and documentaries and academic studies. The veterans aged, had families, built lives, and carried their experiences in whatever ways they could manage. Some talked about the war, many didn't. All of them carried it with them. The man who had been John Lee rebuilt his life in Canada. He worked, he survived, he moved forward. But Vietnam never really left him. It couldn't. It was written into his body in the form of shrapnel that doctors couldn't remove during that emergency surgery decades ago. Even now, more than 50 years after that mission went wrong, pieces of metal still occasionally work their way out of his hand. A small fragment will push through the skin, a tiny piece of shrapnel making its slow journey from deep tissue to the surface. Each piece that emerges is a physical reminder of that day. The helicopter, the extraction, the pursuing enemy, the explosion of his M60, the pain, the blood, the end of his war. Think about what that means. For more than half a century, his body has been slowly expelling the fragments of Vietnam. While he built a life, raised a family, worked jobs, experienced joys and sorrows and all the ordinary moments of civilian existence, there was always this physical connection to 1969, working its way out. The war wasn't just a memory. It was literal lie inside him, a part of his flesh. He never became an American citizen. Despite serving in the U.S. military, despite being wounded in combat wearing an American uniform, despite earning a Purple Heart, he remained Canadian. The irony is obvious. Thousands of Americans fled to Canada to avoid serving in Vietnam, while he left Canada to volunteer for the war. And in the end, neither country quite knew what to do with him. When asked about his service now, when the story occasionally comes up in conversation, he says something that many veterans of unpopular wars eventually conclude. If he could go back in time, he would convince himself not to go. This statement carries tremendous weight. It's not just regret about the injury. though the permanent damage to his hand certainly plays a role. It's a fundamental reassessment of the idealism that drove him to make such an extreme decision at 16 years old. It's the wisdom of age and experience looking back at the certainty of youth and recognizing it for what it was, a conviction built on incomplete information and romantic notions about war and heroism. Would he have listened to his older self? Probably not. 16-year-olds rarely listen to wisdom that contradicts what they want to believe, but the fact that he wishes he could deliver that warning says something profound about how he views his service now. This doesn't mean his sacrifice was meaningless or that his courage wasn't real. He fought bravely. He served honorably within the context of his service. He was wounded in combat. These facts remain true regardless of how he feels about the decision that led him there. But it does mean that he's part of a larger truth about the Vietnam War, that many of the people who fought in it eventually came to question whether it was worth the cost, whether the sacrifices made sense, whether the ideals that sent them there stood up to the reality of what they experienced. Out of the 7 men in his family, who were of military age during the Vietnam era, 5 went to war. That's an extraordinary percentage, evidence of a family with deep military tradition and strong beliefs about duty and service. Of those 5, at least 1 came back questioning everything he had believed when he left. His story is unique in its specifics: the fake identity, the underage enlistment, the door gunner position, the dramatic injury that revealed his true identity. But it's also representative of something larger. It's the story of how idealism collides with reality, how the romance of military service confronts the brutal truth of combat, how young men make decisions that change their lives in ways they can't possibly understand at the time. Today, the man who was once John Lee lives with his choices. The shrapnel still emerges occasionally, small pieces of metal working their way out like the slow revelation of truth. He has no uniform, no medal, no physical proof of his service. What he has is his hand, scarred mole, partially disabled, a permanent reminder. What he has is his memory. What he has is his story, and perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the story itself is the legacy, not a story of glory or triumph, but a story of a boy who believed so strongly in an ideal that he was willing to lie, to risk everything, to fight in a war that wasn't technically his country's fight. A story of courage and foolishness, intertwined so completely that you can't separate them. A story of sacrifice whose meaning remains complicated and unresolved more than 50 years later. The Vietnam War produced millions of stories, each one unique, each one carrying its own truth. This is one of them. It's the story of how a 16-year-old Canadian boy became Corporal John Lee of the United States Marine Corps, flew combat missions as a helicopter door gunner, was wounded in action, had his identity discovered, and came home to a complicated reception and a lifetime of reflection. It's a story about the cost of conviction, the price of idealism, and the way some decisions echo through an entire lifetime. It's a story about shrapnel, both the kind that's embedded in flesh and the kind that's embedded in memory. And it's a story that deserved to be told, because buried in its specific, unusual circumstances is something universal about young people and war, about conviction and doubt, about heroism and regret, about the distance between who we think we are at 16 and who we become by the time we're old enough to look back and understand what we did. The man who was John Lee served 9 months in Vietnam under a false name, but he's carried that service for more than 50 years under his real one. The war ended decades ago, but for him, like for so many veterans, it never really ended at all.